In the year 270 AD, Roman soldiers began biting their own pay, not out of hunger. They were testing whether the coins were real. The silver denarius, once 90% pure metal, the financial backbone of the greatest empire the ancient world had ever known, had been diluted so many times over 2 centuries that a thin silver wash, barely a few atoms thick, was all that separated it from common copper. Merchants rubbed coins on their robes before accepting them. The wash came off in their hands. Rome was still standing, but its money had already died. The room where money is weighed is always quieter than you expect. It is a small chamber, tucked inside a mint along the Via Sacra, not far from the forum's northern edge. The walls are thick stone, which keeps the air cool even in July, and the floor is dusted with a fine metallic residue that never entirely sweeps away. There are scales here, iron-framed, precise, worn smooth along the balance arm from years of daily use. There are clay jars stoppered with wax. There are ledgers, written in a hand so economical that each entry takes up no more space than a thumbnail. A man sits at the central table. He is not a senator. He is not a general. He holds no title that any historian will record. He is a mint worker, a monetarius, and he has been doing this work since before his beard came in. His job, on this particular morning in the 1st century of the Common Era, is to verify the purity of silver being fed into Rome's most important machine, the denarius. He lifts a coin, holds it to the light, the surface catches the morning, white, almost luminous, the way silver is when it has not been touched by compromise. He does not know that in 200 years, a man in the same chair, doing the same work, will hold what is technically the same coin, same name, same face of the emperor, same inscription, and feel something closer to grief than satisfaction. Because by that point, the coin will be copper, barely kissed with silver, a memory of what money once was. The scales in that future room will still be iron. The ledger will still be careful, but what they measure will have changed beyond recognition. That morning has not yet arrived. For now, the scales are level. The ledger is honest, and the greatest economic system the ancient world has ever assembled is still, quietly and confidently, at work. This is the story of how it came to be, and this is the story of how it died. Slowly, in the way that most great things die, not all at once, but piece by piece, decision by decision, coin by coin, over the long and drowsy arc of centuries. You are in Rome before Rome was Rome. The city is younger than its own mythology. The hills above the Tiber are real enough, 7 of them furred with oak and scrub, but the streets between them are not yet paved. The Forum, which will one day become the commercial and political heart of the known world, is still a low-lying marsh, prone to flooding in the spring, smelling of mud and river grass, and the slow work of water on stone. The people who will build the empire are here, but they do not yet know what they are building. What they do know is how to trade. Before Rome minted a single coin, its economy ran on weight. Bronze, Gesgrave they called it, heavy bronze, was cast into irregular lumps and traded by heft. Not elegant, but honest. You wanted a goat. Someone else wanted clay storage jars. A third person had salt they needed to move before the rains came. The weight of bronze served as a common unit of reckoning, a way of saying this much in a language that everyone in the central Italian hills could read. There were no denominations, no portraits of emperors, no symbols of state authority. Just metal, and the scale beneath it, and the slow arithmetic of exchange. This system worked well enough for a society of farmers and herders moving goods between hilltop villages. It was, in its way, beautifully simple, but simplicity has limits. As Rome began absorbing its neighbours, the Etruscans to the north, the Samnites to the east, the Greek colonies that dotted the long shin of the Italian peninsula, the economy it encountered was considerably more sophisticated than rough lumps of bronze. The Greeks had been using silver coins for centuries. Stamped, denominated, portable, beautiful. Silver coins could cross borders without needing a scale. Silver coins could pay a soldier in a single gesture. Silver coins could move through the channels of Mediterranean commerce the way water moves through an aqueduct, quickly, continuously, with almost no friction at all. The Romans were not slow to notice. Their first experiments with coinage were somewhat imitative. Silver coins minted not in Rome itself, but in Greek cities of southern Italy, produced on Rome's behalf, bearing designs that were frankly borrowed from Hellenic tradition. A young city learning the language of money from older neighbours. There is something almost endearing about it if you look at it from a long enough distance. Rome, which would one day set the financial rules for half the known world, began by copying someone else's homework. But something shifted during the long, devastating catastrophe of the Second Punic War, when the Carthaginian general Hannibal crossed the Alps with his elephants and his mercenaries and spent nearly 15 years marching across Italy, burning towns and annihilating Roman armies at Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, and finally at Cannae, where perhaps 70,000 Roman soldiers died in a single afternoon. The Republic staggered. The treasury was nearly empty. Allies began to waver. And yet Rome did not collapse. Instead, it did what Rome almost always did under pressure. It reorganized. It invented. War is the great clarifier of economics. To fight Carthage, to sustain legions in the field year after year, to rebuild armies destroyed at a stroke, to pay allies and contractors and grain merchants across half the Mediterranean. Rome needed a currency that was not merely functional, but trusted. It needed money that could be standardized, reproduced, and recognized by anyone from Iberia to Macedonia. In 211 BC, in the middle of one of the worst military crises the Republic had ever faced, the Denarius was born. The word comes from denai, meaning 10, because the coin was originally valued at 10 bronze asses. But the number matters less than the metal. The denarius was silver, nearly pure silver, a small disc about the size of a thumbnail, carrying on one face the helmeted head of the goddess Roma, and on the reverse the Dioscuri, the twin divine horsemen galloping eternally leftward. The coin weighed roughly 4 grams. It was clean. It was authoritative. It was, in almost every technical sense, what we would now call sound money. And you can still feel that authority in the Roman coins that survive in museum cases today. The heft of them, the crispness of the die work, the way they seem to insist on their own reality. The denarius did not merely allow Rome to fight Hannibal. It allowed Rome to think bigger than Hannibal. While Carthage financed its campaigns through loans and mercenaries who had to be paid at the campaign's end, Rome could pay ongoing soldiers with something that those soldiers' families could spend at home. Money that circulates is money that does more than one thing at once. A silver denarius paid to a legionary became a purchase at a market stall in a Campanian town, which became income for a farmer who sold olives, which became rent paid to a landowner, which became tax collected by the state and fed back into the mints. The coin did not sit still. It moved through the whole body of the economy, doing quiet work at every stop. What made this possible? What made the denarius trustworthy enough to circulate through all those hands without being questioned was silver, not the denomination stamped on it, not the authority of the emperor's portrait, not the inscription around the rim, the metal itself. Silver was silver everywhere in the Mediterranean world. A merchant in Alexandria could weigh a Roman denarius and know immediately what it was worth relative to a Greek drachma or a Phoenician shekel. The coin transcended borders because its content transcended politics. This is worth sitting with for a moment. Trust in the ancient world was essentially chemical. It was a matter of composition. Here is something that every financial historian encounters when studying this period. The Roman economy did not merely use money. It was built from money in a way that had no real precedent in the ancient world. Earlier empires, Persia, Egypt, Macedon, had used coinage extensively, but their economies retained large sectors that ran on grain tribute, palace redistribution, or direct barter. Rome was different. By the late Republic, money had penetrated Roman life at every level. from the slave auctioned in the Forum, to the senator speculating on Sicilian grain harvests, to the legionary calculating how many more years of service he needed before his pension land grant came through. A Roman soldier's pay was called a stipendium. He received it roughly 3 times a year, in installments that corresponded to the campaign seasons. Out of it, he paid for his own rations, his equipment replacement, and any fines levied by his commanding officer. What remained was his to spend, save, or send home. The army, in other words, was not merely a military institution. It was a distribution system, a mechanism for taking state revenue and pushing it out into the provinces where legions were stationed, where it would be spent in local markets and taverns and workshops, creating the commercial infrastructure that followed Rome wherever Rome went. The silver that made all of this possible had to come from somewhere. It came from Spain, the mines of Hispania, and especially the enormous deposit at what is now called Rio Tinto, in the southwestern corner of the Iberian Peninsula, were among the richest silver deposits in the ancient world. Rome seized them from Carthage at the end of the Second Punic War, and what followed was an industrial operation of almost startling scale. The geographer Strabo, writing in the 1st century BC, estimated that 40,000 workers laboured at the Rio Tinto mines. Modern archaeological evidence confirms that the site was producing an extraordinary volume of silver ore, enough to feed Rome's mints continuously for generations. The landscape around those mines was stripped bare. The air above them was permanently hazy with smelting smoke that hung over the valley like a low, bronze-coloured cloud. The rivers running through the mineral zone ran orange-red with waste, which is where the name Rio Tinto, the Red River, originates. You can still see that colour today in satellite photographs of the same stretch of southern Spain, because the chemistry of the ancient Roman smelting operations left traces in the soil that 2,000 years have not entirely washed away. The Romans were here. You can see them in the water. You could say, without exaggeration, that the Roman Denarius was built on Spanish earth and the suffering of enslaved people. That is not a modern reframing. It is simply what the ancient sources describe, without apparent disturbance. Slavery was the engine that extracted the silver, that minted the coin that paid the soldier, that expanded the empire, that captured more slaves to work more mines. This circular logic was so embedded in the structure of the Roman economy that almost no ancient writer stopped to question it, the way almost no one in a city questions the infrastructure that carries water to their tap. But set that horror aside for a moment, not to excuse it, but to look at what the system produced when viewed from a long and quiet distance. By the height of the Republic, Rome had created something genuinely novel in human history. A large-scale, monetized, integrated economy stretching from the Atlantic coast of Iberia to the Black Sea, from the Rhine to the edges of the Sahara. Goods moved across this system in quantities that archaeologists can still trace in the distribution patterns of amphora shards, of terracotta lamps, of olive oil storage jars, found in the ruins of towns that have not been inhabited for 17 centuries. Wine from the Po Valley. Garum, that sharp fermented fish sauce that was to the Roman kitchen what salt is to ours, from Lusitania. Grain from Egypt and North Africa. Wool from Britain. Glass from Syria. Amber from the Baltic coast, traded southward through Germanic territory, along routes that Roman merchants knew and Roman coins followed. All of it priced, traded, and settled in silver. All of it moving through an economic circulatory system that required, above everything else, a currency that people trusted without thinking about it. Here is something worth pausing on, quietly, in the way that financial historians occasionally pause and allow themselves to be astonished. The Roman economy at its peak may have represented something between 1/4 and 1/3 of total global economic output. Not because the rest of the world was primitive. It was not, but because Rome had solved, for its time and place, the fundamental problem of economic coordination. It had created a currency that strangers trusted. It had built roads on which goods could actually move. It had enforced contracts across a vast territory through a legal system whose sophistication would not be matched in Western Europe for over 1,000 years. The denarius, in other words, was not just money. It was the blood in the body of an empire. It moved, it carried, it sustained. And like all blood, the moment it changed its composition, the moment something began to dilute what it was made of, everything that depended on it began slowly and almost invisibly to change as well. That change was still far off on the morning when a mint worker held a freshly struck coin to the light on the Via Sacra. The coin was white and clean and honest. The empire was young and hungry and still expanding. There were wars still to be won, provinces still to be taken, mines still being opened in the red earth of Spain. The scales were level. The ledger was balanced. And for a civilization built so completely on the weight of silver, that balance felt, in those early centuries, as permanent and reliable as the stone beneath the hills. It was not, of course. Nothing that depends on trust ever is. But the reckoning was still a long way off. And the morning light on the Via Sacra was doing what morning light always does in Rome, making everything look like it will last forever. What we must understand, what the story we are about to trace requires us to understand, is that the Roman monetary system was not simply a technical arrangement, it was a social contract. Every time a Roman citizen accepted a denarius in payment, they were expressing a form of faith. Faith in the metal, faith in the mint, faith in the state that stood behind both. And like all contracts built on faith, it could only hold for as long as the parties to it continued to believe. The first test of that belief was already coming. It was wearing the face of empire's own ambition. And it was moving toward Rome on the slow, grinding wheels of conquest. There is a particular kind of mathematics that only empires understand. It is not the clean mathematics of accounting, where columns balance and surpluses carry forward neatly into the next year. It is something messier and more conditional, a mathematics of violence and probability, where the cost of an army is weighed against the wealth of the territory that army might subjugate, and where the calculations only work as long as there is always somewhere new to conquer. Rome understood this mathematics better than any civilization before it. For several centuries, Rome worked it brilliantly. And then, in the way of all brilliant things that depend on conditions that cannot last, it stopped working. Begin with the tributum. In the early Republic, Roman citizens paid a direct war tax, a levy on property, assessed and collected to fund military campaigns. It was not a permanent fixture of Roman life, but a temporary measure, called up in times of military need, and repaid, in theory, when a campaign's spoils allowed it. After the conquest of Macedon in 168 BC, the tributum was abolished entirely for Roman citizens. The wealth flooding in from Macedonia, from the silver mines of Thrace, from the treasury of a Hellenistic kingdom that had accumulated riches for generations, it was enough to make the idea of taxing Roman citizens seem almost quaint. The empire was paying for itself. More than paying for itself, it was generating surpluses that built the roads, the aqueducts, the temples, the public baths that made Rome feel to its inhabitants like a city that had always existed and always would. But follow the money more carefully and a more complicated picture emerges. The revenue that made Roman citizenship feel like a privilege rather than an obligation did not come from the sky. It came from provinces. It came from the systematic extraction of wealth from conquered peoples who did not share in the prosperity they were funding. The publicani, the tax farmers, were the agents of this extraction, men who bid at auction for the right to collect taxes in a given province, and then proceeded to collect considerably more than they had bid, keeping the difference as profit. They were, by the standards of any era, remarkably efficient. They were also, by the standards of almost any era, remarkably brutal. Cicero, in his letters and speeches, describes the provincials of Asia Minor living in a state of chronic anxiety around tax collection time, hiding livestock, undervaluing property, pleading poverty with the rehearsed urgency of people who had learned that the publicani were not interested in the truth of their circumstances, only in the yield. The Greek cities of the eastern Mediterranean, which had sophisticated commercial traditions going back centuries before Rome existed, found themselves funneling wealth westward to a capital that consumed without producing, that built without mining, that feasted without farming. Not because they chose to, but because the legions were there, and the legions did not ask. Here is the question that haunts every serious study of Roman fiscal history. Was this extraction sustainable? In the short run, obviously yes. In the medium run, the evidence suggests it was. For several centuries, Roman taxation, however brutal in its collection, did produce the revenue that funded the infrastructure and military capacity that allowed Rome to extract more revenue. A kind of grim but functioning loop. The problem was not the exploitation itself. The problem was that the loop required constant expansion to maintain its pressure. A province, once conquered and pacified, yielded less each decade as its most movable wealth was stripped away and its population adjusted to survive at minimum taxable levels. The next province had to be bigger, or richer, or both. And for a long time, the next province was. The conquest of Greece, then Asia Minor, then Syria, then Egypt, then Gaul. Each acquisition brought an enormous one-time infusion of wealth and a long-term revenue stream that for a generation or two more than compensated for the costs of governance. Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, those brutal campaigns that killed perhaps 1 million Gauls and enslaved another million, generated such vast quantities of gold and silver that Caesar was able to repay enormous personal debts, fund a political career that reshaped Rome entirely, and still leave the Roman treasury significantly better off than he found it. War, done at the right scale against the right opponent, was the most profitable enterprise Rome had ever discovered. The Emperor Trajan understood this better than almost anyone. His Dacian Wars, fought in 2 campaigns between 101 and 106 AD against the kingdom in what is now Romania and Moldova, were among the most financially motivated conflicts Rome ever undertook. Dacia had gold, an enormous quantity of it. Estimates vary, but ancient sources suggest Trajan brought back perhaps 165 metric tons of gold and 330 metric tons of silver from the Dacian campaigns. Trajan's column in Rome, still standing today in the forum that bears his name, is essentially a very tall advertisement for the profitability of the enterprise. A 100-meter-high spiral of carved stone depicting the campaign in such careful detail that historians and archaeologists still use it as a primary source for Roman military equipment and tactics. With Dacian gold flooding the mints, Trajan financed construction projects that dazzled the ancient world. His forum, his markets, his column, the enormous harbour complex at Ostia that allowed Rome to receive grain ships from across the Mediterranean. He lowered the age of eligibility for the alimenta, a welfare program that provided loans to Italian farmers and used the interest to fund food subsidies for children of the poor. He was, by any contemporary measure, one of the most popular emperors Rome ever produced. His name would become a shorthand for good governance for centuries after his death. But Trajan also did something that in retrospect looks more like an ending than a triumph. In 116 AD, after a campaign that pushed Roman forces all the way to the Persian Gulf, he stood at the water's edge and looked south toward the horizon, toward India, toward the trade routes that he knew he could not follow. He was an old man by then, his body worn by decades of campaigning. He began to withdraw. He died the following year, returning to Rome, and his successor Hadrian immediately abandoned Mesopotamia, Trajan's last great conquest, because Hadrian understood, with the clarity of a careful administrator, that the territory could not be held. The cost of garrisoning it exceeded the revenue it generated. That moment, Hadrian's withdrawal, his decision to consolidate rather than expand, is one of the most consequential financial decisions in Roman history. Not because it was wrong, it was almost certainly correct. The Roman Empire had reached approximately the limits of what it could effectively administer and defend. But by consolidating, Rome had also, for the first time, made explicit a problem that had been quietly accumulating for decades: The fiscal model that had funded everything, the roads, the aqueducts, the legions, the grain dole, the public games, the temples, required expansion to function. And expansion was over. Consider the numbers as they stood around the beginning of the 2nd century AD. The Roman military, perhaps 300,000 to 400,000 men, under arms at any given time, organized into legions and auxiliary cohorts stationed along the vast frontier arc that stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia, cost an enormous amount to maintain. Modern historians have estimated that military expenditure consumed somewhere between 50 and 75% of all imperial revenue. That left very little for everything else. The administration of provinces, the maintenance of infrastructure, the grain subsidies, the periodic spectacles that emperors used to maintain public goodwill. While the empire was expanding, this was manageable, because the spoils of new conquests regularly provided the lump sum infusions of capital that could top up a treasury strained by ongoing military costs. Dacia's gold paid for Trajan's forum, and then some. Egypt's grain supply, which Augustus had effectively monopolized, meant that the cost of feeding Rome's urban population was manageable. But once the frontier stabilized, once Hadrian began building walls, literally building walls, to mark the edges of what Rome was willing to defend, the one-time windfall stopped coming. The army still cost what it had always cost. The provinces still provided their regular revenue. But the mathematics began very quietly to tighten. Hadrian's Wall is a useful object to think about here. It runs for 80 Roman miles across the narrow waste of northern Britain, from the Solway Firth in the west to the Tyne in the east, through some of the most inhospitable moorland in Europe. It took perhaps 6 years and many thousands of workers to build. It was garrisoned continuously for roughly 3 centuries. Every soldier stationed on that wall had to be paid, fed, equipped, and eventually pensioned. Every stone in that wall had to be quarried, transported, and laid by someone who could otherwise have been farming or trading or generating taxable economic activity. The wall was magnificent. The wall was also expensive in a way that no conquest had ever been, because, unlike a conquest, it did not pay for itself. It just cost, every year, without end. And Hadrian's Wall was only one wall among many. The Rhine frontier, the Danube frontier, the desert limes in North Africa and Syria, the entire eastern border with Parthia, later Sassanid Persia, which required not just walls, but permanent armies of considerable size, because Persia was a serious military power that Rome could not simply absorb. Each of these frontiers was a line of continuous expense stretching across the map, requiring maintenance, garrison troops, supply chains, and the administrative apparatus to manage all of it. When you add it together, the Roman Empire in the 2nd century AD was an organization whose primary product was its own defense, and whose ability to pay for that defense was beginning, very slowly, to outrun its income. The emperors of the 2nd century were by and large intelligent and capable men. The Antonine dynasty, Antoninus Pius, who reigned for 23 years without leaving Italy, presiding over a period of relative peace and prosperity that later Romans would look back on with something like longing, understood that the machinery they had inherited was requiring more maintenance. They did not, for the most part, debase the currency significantly. They economized where they could. They relied on the accumulated prestige and infrastructure of 2 centuries of imperial governance to carry the system forward. And for a generation or two, this worked. The empire felt stable. The coins felt solid. The markets of the Mediterranean felt, to anyone living through those decades, like the permanent furniture of a permanent world. But underneath the stability, the arithmetic was changing. The province that had been conquered a century ago was now a mature economy integrated into the Roman system, yielding steady tax revenue, yes, but nothing like the initial windfall of conquest. The mines of Spain, which had supplied the silver for Rome's monetary system for so long, were beginning to show signs of depletion. The deepest and richest veins had been worked for generations. What remained required more labor and more ingenuity to extract. The yield was not collapsing, but it was not growing either. And the costs, the army, the frontier, the games, the grain, never stopped growing. Here is the question that the financiers of the 2nd century AD could not quite bring themselves to ask directly, perhaps because the answer was too uncomfortable. What happens to an empire whose revenue model depends on expansion when the expansion ends? What do you do when there is nowhere left to conquer that is worth the cost of conquering? The answer, it turned out, was simpler and more terrible than any of them would have preferred. You find another source of revenue. You find something that looks, from the outside, like financial management, but is at its core something much older and much darker. You find a way to make the coins say something other than what they contain. You debase the currency. That word, debase, carries a moral charge that is not entirely accidental. To debase something is to lower its character, to corrupt its integrity, to make it less than what it claimed to be. When Romans began debasing the denarius, they were not simply making a technical adjustment to monetary policy. They were making a promise and then quietly breaking it, keeping the same coin, the same name, the same imperial portrait, while reducing the substance behind all of it. And the terrible efficiency of this method was that most people did not notice immediately. The coins still looked the same. They still jingled in the same way in a leather purse. The merchants still accepted them for a while, because they still had the emperor's face on them. And who were they to argue with the emperor's face? That quiet non-noticing would buy the empire time. It would buy it decades, in fact, but the debt it created, not a debt of silver, but a debt of trust, was accumulating in the background, gaining interest at a rate that no Roman financier had a formula for. When it finally came due, the payment would be severe. But all of that is still ahead of us, still gathering in the distance like weather. For now, on the sunlit frontier roads of the 2nd century, the mule trains carrying pay chests to the legions still contain coins of respectable weight and honest silver. The arithmetic of empire is tightening, but the system has not yet found its breaking point. It has not yet had to choose between the truth of its coins and the cost of its walls. If your eyes are growing heavy, let them close. The story of Rome will still be here when you return to it. If this kind of slow, careful history speaks to something in you, a subscription means the next chapter is already waiting. Rest now. We will keep going together. If you had to choose a single generation to be born into, assuming you were wealthy enough, or simply fortunate enough, to enjoy what that generation offered, you might choose the century between the accession of Augustus and the death of Hadrian. The Roman world in those years had a quality of settled prosperity that feels almost dreamlike when you read the contemporary accounts. The roads were good. The markets were full. The currency was stable. Pirates, which had plagued Mediterranean trade for centuries before Rome finally eradicated them under Pompey, were gone. You could sail from Alexandria to Ostia with a reasonable expectation of arriving with your cargo intact. You could carry a purse from one end of the empire to the other and spend the same coins in the markets of Britain that had been minted in the workshops of Rome. The architect of this prosperity, or at least of the framework that made it possible, was Augustus, the first emperor, who is a more interesting economic figure than he is usually given credit for being. We remember him for the peace he established, the literature he patronized, the temples he rebuilt, the Augustan legend of cultural renewal. But beneath the cultural program was a fiscal architecture of considerable sophistication. Augustus understood that a stable empire required stable money, and that stable money required a reliable supply of silver and gold, and he knew exactly where to find it. Egypt. The conquest of Egypt in 30 BC, following the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra, was not primarily a military triumph, though it was that too. It was, above all, a financial event of the first order. Cleopatra's treasury, the accumulated wealth of the Ptolemaic dynasty, one of the richest royal houses the ancient world had produced, was enormous. Ancient sources, which are not always reliable with large numbers, suggest something in the range of 700 to 800 million sesterces. When Augustus shipped this treasure back to Rome, the effect on the Roman financial system was immediate and measurable. Interest rates, which had been elevated by years of civil war and political uncertainty, fell dramatically, from around 12% to around 4%, according to ancient accounts. This is not a small move. This is the kind of interest rate compression that signals to an entire economy that the crisis is over, that capital is now cheap, that it is safe to invest and build and hire. But Augustus also understood that Egypt was not just a one-time windfall. It was a permanent asset. The Nile Delta was the most productive agricultural land in the Mediterranean world, capable of generating grain surpluses that could feed Rome's urban population year after year. As Augustus designated Egypt an imperial province governed directly by himself through an appointed prefect, and he made it illegal for any Roman senator to visit Egypt without his personal permission. This last provision sounds like paranoia, but it was actually strategic clarity. Control of Egypt's grain meant control of Rome's urban food supply, which meant control of the political stability of the capital. Augustus was not going to allow any ambitious senator to wander into that equation unsupervised. What followed, for about 2 centuries, was something that future generations would call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It was not, of course, entirely peaceful. There were frontier wars, provincial rebellions, the occasional catastrophic military defeat, and the chronic low-level violence of an imperial system maintaining order across an enormous and diverse territory. But measured against what came before and what came after, the Pax Romana was a period of relative stability in which long-distance trade flourished. At a scale the ancient world had not previously seen. Goods moved, money moved, ideas and technologies moved with them. The extent of this trade still has the capacity to surprise. Roman artifacts, coins, ceramics, glassware, have been found in Indian burial sites and in Chinese archaeological contexts. A 1st-century text called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a kind of merchant's handbook for the Indian Ocean trade, lists dozens of ports along the coasts of Arabia, East Africa, and India where Roman traders were active. The Romans imported black pepper, cinnamon, muslin, pearls, and ivory from the East, and they exported wine, glassware, copper, lead and silver coin to pay for it. The elder Pliny, writing in the 1st century AD, complained with the resigned irritability of a man who had done the calculation and found the answer upsetting, that India, Arabia and China were draining 100 million sesterces per year from the Roman Empire, in exchange for luxuries that served no practical purpose and only encouraged effeminacy. Pliny was not entirely wrong. The trade deficit with the East was real. Roman gold and silver coin genuinely did flow eastward and not return. Indian merchants had no equivalent appetite for Roman goods, so the settlement was often in precious metal. Archaeologists have found Roman coins at dozens of sites in southern India, in quantities that suggest this was not incidental but systematic. Every aureus or denarius that left Rome for Malabar was a coin that was not circulating in the Roman economy. Over time, this outflow put pressure on the money supply that Rome had to compensate for, one way or another. But these were the concerns of a system under pressure, not a system in crisis. The remarkable thing about the first 2 centuries AD is how well the Roman financial system absorbed these pressures. The trade deficit, the growing military costs, the aging infrastructure, the periodic shocks of drought or disease, without breaking. The coins remained sound, the markets remained open, and in the cities that ringed the Mediterranean, from Carthage to Antioch to London to Lyon, a kind of commercial civilization took root that was, by the standards of its time, genuinely prosperous and surprisingly egalitarian in its reach, not equal, nothing like equal, but broad in a way that had not previously existed. The Roman financial crisis of 33 AD is one of the period's most instructive episodes, precisely because of how quickly it resolved. Under the Emperor Tiberius, Augustus's successor, a capable but deeply uncomfortable man who seems to have found the entire business of ruling other people something of an imposition. A credit crunch developed in the Roman financial system with an eerie structural similarity to events that would not recur until the early 21st century. Too many loans had been made against land as collateral. Creditors called in their debts. Debtors could not liquidate fast enough. Interest rates spiked. Credit contracted. For several months, the Roman financial system seized. Tiberius resolved it by releasing 100 million sesterces from the imperial treasury into the economy as low-interest loans secured against land. It worked. The crisis passed. Historians debate the details, but the essential fact is clear. Rome had a central banking impulse, a willingness to deploy state resources to stabilize private credit markets that would not reappear in Western Europe for something like 16 centuries. The Pax Romana was not merely a military achievement, it was a financial achievement, and one that required continuous management and periodic intervention to sustain. What sustained it, more than anything else, was the character of the emperors themselves. The 5 emperors who are collectively called the Antonines, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, governed between 96 and 180 AD, with a consistency of purpose and quality of judgment that was entirely unplanned and almost statistically improbable. Each of them inherited the empire by adoption rather than by birth, which had the practical effect of selecting for competence rather than lineage. Gibbon, writing in the 18th century, called the period of their combined rule the time in human history when the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. That is probably overstated, but the economic data supports at least a qualified version of the claim. Yet, even in the best years of the Antonine peace, there were costs accumulating that the prosperity of the era could not quite conceal. Hadrian's building program was ambitious to the point of extravagance. His villa at Tivoli, outside Rome, was not a house but a city, a sprawling complex of pavilions, baths, libraries, and artificial lakes that must have required a workforce of thousands and a budget that staggers the imagination. Hadrian also rebuilt the Pantheon, which still stands, and rebuilt temples in Athens, Jerusalem, and across the East. He was an aesthete who happened to be emperor, and he spent accordingly. The treasury absorbed it. But the treasury was not bottomless. Then came the Antonine Plague. It arrived from the east in 165 AD, brought back by soldiers returning from the Parthian campaigns under the co-emperor Lucius Verus. It spread through the legions first, then into the civilian population, moving along the very road network and trade routes that the Pax Romana had made so efficient. The disease, probably smallpox, though ancient descriptions are not precise enough for certainty, killed between 5 and 10 million people over roughly 15 years. That is a conservative estimate. Some scholars put it higher. In a population of perhaps 60 to 70 million, even the lower figure represents a catastrophic loss. What does it do to an economy when a significant fraction of its labor force dies? It disrupts agriculture first, because farming is labor-intensive, and the dead do not harvest crops. Then it disrupts trade, because the merchants who connected producers to markets in one city to consumers in another city are themselves dying, and the trust networks they maintained, the letters of credit, the personal relationships, the knowledge of which broker in which port could be relied upon, die with them. Then it disrupts the military, because soldiers die in plagues just as readily as civilians, and replacement soldiers have to be found and trained and equipped. All of this costs money. All of it comes at a moment when the tax base that funds the money is itself contracting. Marcus Aurelius, who became sole emperor in 169 AD after the death of his co-emperor, is one of the most extraordinary figures in Roman history. A philosopher-king, in the literal sense, who wrote the Meditations in spare moments between military campaigns and who seems to have understood perfectly well that the empire he was governing was in deeper trouble than its surface stability suggested. He spent most of his reign on the Danube frontier, fighting the Marcomannic Wars against Germanic tribes who were pressing southward with a persistence that previous centuries had not encountered. He won those wars, but the winning cost enormously. There is a detail from this period that deserves particular attention because it tells you more about the state of imperial finances than almost any other single fact. Faced with an empty treasury and unwilling to debase the currency further than the modest reductions his predecessors had already made, Marcus Aurelius held a public auction in the Forum of Trajan. He put up for sale the imperial household goods, gold and silver plate, jeweled cups, silken clothing, even some of the palace furniture and the paintings that had hung in imperial rooms. The sale went on for 2 months. It raised enough money to fund the campaigns that needed funding. And then Marcus Aurelius bought almost none of it back. There is something in that detail, the philosopher-emperor selling the furniture to pay the soldiers, that captures the essential condition of Rome in the second half of the 2nd century. The system was still functioning. The coins were still respectable. The roads were still maintained. But the margins were thinning. The cushion between revenue and expenditure that had allowed previous emperors to build and endow and patronize without constraint was compressing. The state was becoming, in the language of modern finance, cash flow negative. Not yet insolvent, but no longer comfortably liquid. The Golden Age had a hidden bill, and it was coming due. Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD at Vindobona, modern Vienna, on the Danube frontier, which is where he had spent the better part of his last decade. He was, by every account, a tired man. He had managed, through a combination of intelligence, frugality, and sheer administrative competence, to hold the system together across one of the most difficult periods the empire had yet faced. But what he left behind was not the prosperous, self-sustaining empire he had inherited. It was a leaner, more stressed, more militarized version of the same structure, one that would prove far less capable of absorbing the shocks that were already gathering beyond the frontier. His son Commodus was the first emperor born in the purple, the first since Domitian to inherit rather than earn the throne. The sequence of adopted merit had ended. What came next would be different in almost every way. On the night of July 18th, 64 AD, a fire began near the Circus Maximus in the valley between the Palatine and Aventine hills of Rome. What happened next, whether it spread by accident or by design, whether Nero watched it from a tower while playing his lyre, whether he ordered it set to clear land for a new palace, has been debated by historians for 2,000 years and will probably never be definitively resolved. What is not in dispute is the fire's scale. It burned for 6 days, consumed a large portion of the city, and destroyed or damaged 10 of Rome's 14 administrative districts. By the time it was finally controlled, Rome was a ruin smelling of ash and wet stone, with homeless citizens sheltering in whatever remained. The gardens outside the walls, the porticos of temples, the open ground along the Tiber's banks. Nero's response to the disaster was, by ancient standards, fairly competent. He opened the imperial gardens for the homeless. He arranged for grain to be distributed at reduced prices. He supervised the rebuilding himself, imposing new urban planning regulations that widened streets and required fire-resistant materials, and created open plazas that would act as fire breaks if disaster recurred. What he also did, almost simultaneously, was begin building for himself a palace complex so vast and so extravagant that even his contemporaries, who were not easily shocked by imperial excess, found it remarkable. The Domus Aurea, the Golden House, was not merely a palace. It was a transformation of the urban landscape of Rome into a personal possession. A complex that incorporated artificial lakes, formal gardens, dining rooms with rotating ceilings inlaid with ivory, and a colossal bronze statue of Nero himself, perhaps 30 meters tall, installed at the entrance. All of this required money. The rebuilding of Rome required money. The grain distribution required money. The imperial court, always expensive, required money. And Nero's treasury, strained before the fire by years of extravagant spending, was under a new and particular kind of pressure. It is at this point, around 64 AD, the same year as the fire, that we find the first clear evidence of something that would define the rest of Roman monetary history: the deliberate systematic debasement of the silver denarius. What Nero did was this. He reduced the weight of the silver denarius from approximately 3.9 grams to approximately 3.4 grams. He also reduced its silver purity from roughly 97.5% to roughly 93.5%. These are not enormous reductions taken in isolation. A single coin before and after the change would look almost identical to the naked eye, weigh almost the same in the palm of a hand, and spend exactly the same way at a market stall. But the implications of these reductions were profound, because they answered a question that no Roman emperor before Nero had ever formally answered. Can you take silver out of the coins without anyone noticing? And Nero's answer, for a time at least, was yes. The mechanics of debasement are worth understanding in some detail, because they are not complicated, and yet they had consequences that compounded across centuries. To debase a coin, the mint took the silver being used to produce denarii and alloyed it with copper. The more copper you added, the further your supply of silver went. You could produce more coins from the same quantity of silver, because each coin contained less of it. The extra coins could be used to pay the bills that the treasury could not otherwise meet. It was, in the most immediate sense, a way of creating money from nothing, or more precisely, from the fiction that a copper-silver alloy was worth what a silver-silver alloy would have been. Now the question that immediately follows is, why didn't the market notice? Why didn't merchants and bankers look at the new coins and say, these are not the same as the old ones? The answer is that many of them did notice, eventually. But there is an inherent lag in the system, and it works in the following way. Coins enter circulation one by one, through government payments and wages and grain purchases. At any given moment, the population of coins in circulation includes old, pure coins alongside new, debased coins. Because both carry the same nominal value, both say in effect I am a denarius, they spend interchangeably for a while. The denarius is, after all, a thing people have trusted their whole lives. The emperor's face on the coin carries a kind of institutional authority that takes time to erode. The economic thinker Nicholas Copernicus, the same man who proposed that the Earth moved around the sun, formulated an observation about money that anticipates the Roman problem precisely, though he was writing 15 centuries after the fact. The observation was later systematized by the English financier Thomas Gresham, and is now known as Gresham's Law: bad money drives out good. What this means in practice is that when two currencies of nominally equal value, but different actual values circulate simultaneously, people will spend the inferior one and save the superior one. The worse money drives, the better money out of circulation, because no rational person wants to part with a coin that is objectively worth more than the transaction requires. This is exactly what happened in Rome after Nero's debasement. Citizens and merchants who had older, purer denarii began hoarding them. The newer, debased coins circulated freely because nobody wanted to hold on to them if they had a choice. The older coins disappeared from everyday transactions, kept under floorboards and in sealed clay jars in the backs of cellars. Archaeologists digging in Roman sites across Europe and North Africa regularly unearth these hoards, small collections of silver coins buried by their owners and never recovered, presumably because the owners died before they could dig them up. Every hoard of old pure coins tells the same quiet story. Someone preferred to hide their good money rather than spend it. The immediate fiscal effect of Nero's debasement was positive. in the narrow sense that it gave the treasury more coins to work with without requiring more silver to produce them. But the medium-term effect was inflationary, and it operated through a mechanism that the Romans, lacking the conceptual vocabulary of modern economics, found difficult to diagnose. As more coins entered circulation relative to the goods available to purchase, prices rose, not dramatically, not immediately, but steadily, the way a tide rises, so gradually that if you look away for an hour, you miss the change, but if you come back the next morning, the watermark is unmistakably higher. Nero's reign ended in 68 AD, with a coup that forced him to suicide, the first emperor in the Julio-Claudian dynasty to die by violence, though not the last. What came after was the Year of the Four Emperors, a civil war that saw 4 successive rulers in 12 months, armies marching against each other across the Italian peninsula, and the kind of fiscal chaos that military conflict always brings. The eventual winner, Vespasian, was an earthy, practical soldier from an equestrian family who had made his career in the army. He had none of Nero's taste for spectacle or architecture. What he had was a clear-eyed understanding that the empire was running short of money, and that something had to be done about it. Vespasian's fiscal management of the empire has been somewhat obscured by the story that ancient writers love to tell about him: his tax on urine. Public latrines in Rome discharged into collection vats, and fullers, the tradesmen who cleaned and processed wool cloth, purchased the urine to use as a cleaning agent. Vespasian imposed a tax on this transaction. When his son Titus expressed disgust at the revenue source, Vespasian held a coin under his nose and asked whether it smelled. Titus said it did not. Vespasian said that that was the point. Pecunia non olet. Money does not stink. It is a wonderful story, and it captures something real about Vespasian's character. He was a man untroubled by the sources of necessary revenue, which is perhaps the most useful quality an emperor with an empty treasury could possess. He taxed, he cut spending, he sold off some of the more extravagant public projects, and he stabilized the Flavian dynasty's finances without abandoning the monetary system. His son Domitian, who ruled from 81 to 96 AD, briefly restored the silver content of the denarius to something closer to its pre-Nero level, a decision that suggests he understood the long-term damage that debasement caused, or at least that someone in his treasury did. Domitian's denarius was purer than Nero's. It was not quite as pure as Augustus's. But it was a genuine attempt at monetary restoration, and for a few decades the trajectory appeared to have reversed. It had not reversed. It had merely paused. The resumption of debasement under subsequent emperors was not dramatic or announced. It happened the way all such resumptions happen. Quietly, incrementally, each reduction small enough to seem almost inconsequential in isolation. By the time of Trajan, the silver content of the denarius had settled at around 90%. Under Hadrian and Antoninus Pius, it declined further toward 85%. These were not catastrophic reductions. The coins were still recognizably silver. They still functioned as currency without significant friction. But the direction of travel was established, and it pointed in only one direction. What Nero had done, what he had actually done, beneath the fire and the palace and the lyre playing, was demonstrate that the currency could be manipulated. He had shown that the line between what a coin said it was and what it actually was could be moved, quietly and profitably, without immediate consequence. This demonstration was, in retrospect, a kind of original sin in Roman monetary history. Once it was known that debasement was possible, it was available as a tool to every emperor who came after. Not all of them used it. Some used it less than others. But none of them could unknow what Nero had proven. The coin had always been, at some level, a promise. Nero had discovered that promises could be diluted. There is a question worth sitting with here, in the quiet of whatever room you are in as the night deepens. Was Nero's debasement the cause of Rome's eventual monetary collapse? The answer is no, not in any simple sense. The fire of 64 AD was a genuine emergency. The costs of rebuilding a city are real. Every government in every era has faced the problem of expenditures that exceed immediate revenues, and debasement, printing money in the modern idiom, is one of the oldest responses to that problem. Nero's mistake was not that he debased the coin. His mistake was that he did it in a way that could not be undone. Once the precedent existed, the institutional memory retained it. And future emperors, facing their own emergencies, would reach for the same solution with steadily less restraint. The philosopher Seneca, who was Nero's tutor and one of the most astute observers of power in the ancient world, wrote in his essays about the nature of gifts and obligations that the appearance of generosity without its substance is a form of fraud. He was not talking about money, but he might as well have been. What the debased Denarius offered was the appearance of value without its substance, the form of a promise without the metal to back it up, and Rome, for the next 2 centuries, would learn by slow and painful degrees what it costs to live on the appearance of a promise long after the promise itself has been quietly retired. Sleep settles into the spaces between thoughts. Outside, somewhere in the city, a fountain continues its work, as it has all night, as it will until morning, water moving through old stone channels with a patience that has nothing to do with the urgency of the empires that built them. The coins that passed through these streets 2,000 years ago are somewhere still, in museum cases, in earth, dissolved into rust and mineral suggestion. But their story is not finished. It is only beginning to get to the part that matters. It arrived from the east, as so many things did. The soldiers of the Parthian campaign, returning to their winter quarters along the Euphrates in 165 AD, brought something back with them that no loot and no triumph could compensate for. The precise nature of the disease has been debated by medical historians for generations. Smallpox is the leading candidate, based on the symptoms described by the physician Galen, who treated it directly and left records of what he saw. The rash, the fever that came in waves, the skin erupting in ways that Galen, who had seen most things a physician could see in the ancient world, found remarkable enough to describe in detail. Whatever it was, it spread with the efficiency that only a population with no prior exposure can provide. The Antonine plague, as it has come to be known, moved through the Roman world along the very arteries that the Pax Romana had made so effective. The roads that carried grain and garum and amber and fine ceramics from one end of the empire to the other now carried the disease as well. In the bodies of soldiers moving toward their postings, in the clothes of merchants travelling between market towns, in the crowded holds of grain ships crossing from Alexandria to Ostia. By 166 AD, it had reached Rome. By 167 AD, it was in the Rhine frontier garrisons. By the end of the decade, it had touched every province that the roads could reach, which was essentially all of them. The death toll, over 15 years of recurring outbreaks, was somewhere between 5 and 10 million people. Some estimates go higher, particularly for the densely populated urban centres of the East, where crowding accelerated transmission. In some frontier military units, the losses were catastrophic enough to require the enlistment of gladiators, men trained to die for entertainment, now conscripted to die for the empire in a rather different context. In agricultural regions, the labour force that planted and harvested the crops that fed the cities was suddenly agonizingly smaller. Fields went unplanted. Harvests were reduced. The grain that had made Egypt and North Africa the breadbasket of the Roman world still grew, but there were fewer hands to gather it. What does this do to an economy? The answer, if you trace it carefully, is that it does several things simultaneously, and they reinforce each other in unhelpful ways. First, labour becomes scarcer, which in a pre-industrial economy means agricultural output falls. Second, military recruitment becomes harder, which means the cost per soldier rises as the pool of available candidates shrinks. Third, trade is disrupted as the merchants and transporters who maintain commercial networks die at the same rate as everyone else. And the trust relationships they sustained, the personal credit arrangements, the knowledge of local conditions, the relationships with suppliers and buyers across hundreds of miles, cannot be quickly reconstructed. Fourth, tax revenue falls because the people who pay taxes are dying, and the businesses that generated taxable activity are contracting. All four of these effects arrived simultaneously in the late 160s and 170s, at precisely the moment when Marcus Aurelius found himself fighting a major war on the Danube frontier. The Punic Wars, a series of campaigns against Germanic and Sarmatian tribes who were pressing against the Middle Danube boundary with an urgency that earlier generations had not encountered, required a military effort of the kind that the Pax Romana had been designed to make unnecessary. But the Pax Romana was showing its age. The frontier tribes were larger and better organized than they had been. The Roman legions were depleted by plague, and the treasury was absorbing both the cost of the war and the revenue losses of the epidemic simultaneously. Marcus Aurelius responded to this situation with a combination of creativity and austerity that reflects very well on him as an administrator, if not always as a military strategist. He recruited barbarians into the legions in large numbers, a practice that had existed before, but had never been done at this scale. He settled captured Germanic peoples within the empire as agricultural workers and soldier farmers, giving them land in exchange for military service. He was the first emperor to make systematic use of what would later become the federate system that defined late Roman military organization. None of this was without cost. Land grants cost land. Military pay for expanded armies cost money. But it was the best available response to the available facts. The palace auction stands as the most emblematic moment of this period, and it is worth describing in some detail because it reveals, with unusual clarity, both the character of Marcus Aurelius and the financial condition of the empire he governed. With the treasury insufficient to fund the Marcomannic campaigns, he did not debase the currency beyond what his predecessors had already done. Instead, he held a public sale in the Forum of Trajan, at which the imperial household goods were offered to any buyer who could afford them. Gold and silver plate, silk garments, cups set with precious stones, furniture from the imperial apartments, even paintings, images of emperors past, of gods and heroes, of the mythological scenes that decorated the private rooms of the Palatine Hill. The auction lasted 2 months. Citizens came from across Italy to buy a piece of the palace. It must have been a peculiar sight, the most powerful man in the world selling his furniture to pay for a war. The Severan dynasty that followed, beginning with Septimius Severus, who came to power in 193 AD after yet another convulsion of civil war, took a rather different approach to the problem of imperial finances. Where Marcus Aurelius had economized and improvised, Septimius Severus spent. He significantly increased military pay, the first increase in base pay since Domitian's time, and he expanded the size of the army. He founded new legions. He increased the grain ration distributed to the Praetorian Guard in Rome. He was, by temperament and origin, a soldier's emperor, born in North Africa, risen through the ranks, and he understood that the loyalty of the army was the foundation of everything else. His deathbed advice to his sons, as recorded by the historian Cassius Dio, was as blunt as anything in Roman literature. Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all other men. To enrich the soldiers required money. To find money without conquering significant new territory, Septimius Severus's campaigns in Britain and Mesopotamia were profitable in prestige, but not dramatically in treasure, required squeezing the existing system. The silver content of the denarius, which had been in gradual decline since Nero, accelerated its descent under the Severan dynasty. By the end of Septimius Severus's reign in 211 AD, the denarius contained roughly 50 to 60% silver. That is still a significant silver content. A coin with 50% silver is not yet worthless. But it has crossed a psychological threshold. It is now more than half something other than what it claims to be. The Emperor Caracalla, who ruled after his father's death, first jointly with his brother Geta, whom he killed in 212 AD in one of the most cold-blooded fratricides in Roman history, made a decision that has gone down in history as one of Rome's great acts of inclusion, but which was, in its economic logic, something considerably more calculating. The Constitutio Antoniniana of 212 AD extended Roman citizenship to virtually all free inhabitants of the empire. Every free person from the moors of Britain to the deserts of Mesopotamia was, by this single legal act, a Roman citizen. Historians for centuries read this as a moment of genuine universalism, an acknowledgement of the cosmopolitan reality of what the empire had become. But there is a rather more mundane explanation, and the evidence supports it strongly. Roman citizens paid inheritance tax. Non-citizens did not. By extending citizenship to everyone, Caracalla dramatically expanded the tax base for the inheritance levy. He then doubled the rate of that tax from 5% to 10%. The timing is not coincidental. The most generous legal act in Roman history was, at its fiscal core, a tax grab of considerable ingenuity. It says something about the state of imperial finances, that the most creative revenue idea available to an emperor in 212 AD was not a new conquest or a new trade route, but a clever expansion of the taxpayer base for an existing tax. Caracalla also introduced a new coin, the Antoninianus, named for the imperial family, which was nominally a double denarius, worth 2 of the smaller coin. But its silver content was not double that of the denarius. It was perhaps 1.5 times as much, and declining. The Antoninianus was, in essence, a coin that proclaimed one thing and contained another, a coin that wore the face of a double denarius while carrying the substance of something less. This gap between proclamation and substance would only widen in the decades ahead, until it became the defining feature of Roman money in the 3rd century. The Severan dynasty ended with the assassination of Severus Alexander in 235 AD, killed by his own troops in circumstances that have been interpreted variously as mutiny, conspiracy, and simple military impatience. He was 26 years old. With his death, something important concluded. The last dynasty that had maintained any meaningful coherence in Roman imperial governance. What followed would be, in every sense of the word, chaotic. But even before that chaos descended in its full force, the monetary system had already absorbed shocks that would have broken any less deeply rooted institution. The coins were thinner, the promises were lighter. The gaps between what Rome said and what Rome could deliver were beginning slowly to show through the silver wash. There is a quality to the economy of the late Severan period that feels when you read the papyri and the inscriptions and the legal records, like the economy of a man who knows he is spending more than he earns, but cannot quite bring himself to address it directly. The accounts are still being kept, the markets are still open, the roads are still repaired. But the surplus that once existed between revenue and expenditure, that comfortable cushion of imperial prosperity, has been consumed, and what remains is a system running on institutional inertia, on the accumulated trust of 2 centuries of stable governance, on the weight of a name that still commands obedience, even as the substance behind the name is quietly redistributed elsewhere. The frontier kept demanding, the armies kept eating. The plague came back, in a second wave in the 250s, more devastating in some respects than the first, and the silver kept thinning, one small alloy adjustment at a time, each reduction small enough that no single minister had to make a large and clearly wrong decision. It happened by degrees, which is both how most catastrophes happen and why they are so difficult to stop. No one moment was the moment of crisis. It was always the accumulation, always the series of small, individually defensible choices that together constituted a course of action that, taken as a whole, was destroying the foundation of everything. In 235 AD, a soldier named Maximinus Thrax, Maximinus the Thracian, murdered the emperor Severus Alexander and declared himself emperor. He was the first emperor of fully non-senatorial origin, a man who had risen from obscure provincial roots through the ranks of the army to command, and his accession announced something that the following 50 years would make brutally clear. The army had become the only institution in the empire capable of making or unmaking an emperor. What followed is known to historians as the crisis of the 3rd century, and it was, in every relevant sense, a financial catastrophe that wore the mask of a political one. Between 235 and 284 AD, the Roman Empire had approximately 50 emperors. The number varies depending on how you count usurpers, co-emperors and claimants who controlled territory for a matter of weeks before being killed. Some of these men reigned for decades. Others reigned for months. Several lasted only weeks, murdered by the same troops who had acclaimed them before a relief force could arrive from another part of the empire. The Historia Augusta, a sometimes unreliable but always fascinating collection of imperial biographies, lists 30 supposed usurpers of the period in a section that reads, in its accumulation of names and violent ends, like a ledger of institutional failure. What drove this instability was, at its core, economic. The army was the kingmaker. The army also had to be paid. An emperor who could not pay his troops promptly and generously was an emperor who would not remain emperor for long. The competition between rival claimants was therefore partly ideological, partly dynastic, and substantially financial. Which claimant had access to enough money, enough silver, to buy enough loyalty to hold together enough of the empire, to survive the next challenge from the next rival with the next army? In this environment, the treasury was not merely a public institution, it was an instrument of political survival, and the coins it issued were not merely currency. They were the medium through which power was expressed and contested. The Antoninianus, Caracalla's double denarius, already debased at its introduction, underwent, over the middle decades of the 3rd century, a debasement so severe that it constitutes one of the most dramatic monetary collapses in ancient history. Under Gallienus, who governed portions of the empire between 253 and 268 AD, through a period of such concentrated disaster that ancient writers could barely keep pace with cataloguing it, the silver content of the Antoninianus fell from roughly 20 to 30% to something between 2 and 5%. A coin that had been introduced as silver now contained, at the low point, barely a ghost of silver. A thin wash applied to the surface of a copper blank, intended to preserve the appearance of precious metal without any of its substance. Merchants and money changers developed techniques for evaluating these coins that tell you everything you need to know about the state of trust in the monetary system. They rubbed coins on their robes or against stone surfaces to see whether the silver wash came off. They bit coins, the famous bite test, which you might have seen depicted in films about pirates, but which was born not from piracy, but from the Roman monetary crisis of the 3rd century. They weighed coins against each other. They distinguished, by touch and sight and long practice, between coins that were almost entirely copper and coins that retained at least some silver content. The existence of these practices is itself a kind of economic data. They tell you that the nominal value of the coin had divorced from its actual value so completely that commerce required a secondary system of authentication to function. The papyri of Egypt provide what is perhaps the most concrete evidence we have for the inflation that accompanied this monetary collapse. Egypt, as a Roman province, generated an extraordinary volume of written records, contracts, receipts, letters, account books, preserved by the same dry climate that mummified its dead. When historians look at the prices recorded in these documents over the course of the 3rd century, the story they tell is stark. The price of a measure of wheat in Egypt was roughly 8 drachmas in the early 2nd century. By 200 AD, it had risen to around 16 drachmas. By 276 AD, the same measure cost approximately 200 drachmas. By the early 4th century, the price was over 9,000 drachmas. That is an increase of more than 1,000-fold over roughly a century and a half, and the steepest part of that curve falls squarely in the crisis of the 3rd century. This is not historical abstraction. This is what it felt like to be an ordinary person trying to buy food in a Roman market town in the 260s or 270s. The coins you had been paid last month were worth measurably less this month. The price of bread at the stall in the Forum was higher than the price written on the wall last season. If you were a soldier, you received pay that the state could print essentially at will, and you spent that pay in markets where the sellers had no choice but to recalibrate constantly or go out of business. If you were a merchant, you had to decide whether to hold stock and wait for prices to rise further, or sell now for coins that you suspected would be worth less tomorrow. If you were a farmer, you might prefer almost any other form of payment, grain, oil, cloth, a day's labour, to coins whose value you could not predict. The empire itself fragmented under the pressure. In 260 AD, a general named Postumus established the Gallic Empire in the west, a breakaway state incorporating Gaul, Britain, and parts of Spain, after defeating a rival claimant near the Rhine. In the same year, the eastern portions of the empire came under the effective control of Palmyra, the great caravan city of the Syrian desert, whose queen Zenobia would eventually rule territory stretching from Egypt to Asia Minor. For roughly a decade, the Roman Empire existed as three separate political entities, each with its own emperor, its own army, and its own debased coinage. The man who eventually reunited the empire was Aurelian, one of those practical, brutal, militarily brilliant soldier emperors the crisis seemed to produce with some regularity, men who were perfectly adapted to the world the crisis had created, and who might have been less useful in a more orderly age. Aurelian defeated Zenobia, defeated the Gallic Empire, rebuilt the walls of Rome, and attempted, with partial success, to stabilize the monetary system. His new Denarius, sometimes called the Aurelianianus, was marked with the letters Physiproist, or Ka, the Greek equivalent, indicating a ratio of 1 part silver to 20 parts bronze. This is not a rich coin. 1 part silver in 20 is 5%. But it was at least a standardized acknowledgement of what the coin actually was, rather than a pretense of what it had been. Here is something that the surviving sources only hint at, but which is remarkable when you consider it. Aurelian's monetary reform provoked a revolt by the workers in the Roman mints themselves. The mint workers, monetarii, had apparently been engaged in their own fraud within the official fraud, producing coins with even less silver than the officially debased standard required, and pocketing the difference. When Aurelian moved to tighten standards and prosecute the fraudsters, the mint workers of Rome rose in actual armed rebellion. The revolt was suppressed at the cost of thousands of lives with the same efficiency Aurelian brought to everything else. But the episode reveals the depth to which the monetary system had corroded. Even the people charged with making money had given up pretending it meant anything. What happened to commerce during these decades? The short answer is that it contracted, simplified, and in some regions essentially ceased. Long-distance trade, the wine from Italy, the glass from Syria, the garum from Spain, the grain from Egypt that had been the lifeblood of the Pax Romana economy, became increasingly difficult to sustain when the currency in which it was priced was devaluing faster than contracts could be written and honoured. Merchants who had previously operated across the width of the empire retreated to shorter routes, more local networks, transactions that could be completed quickly before the value of whatever was being exchanged had shifted again. Cities, which depended on trade and on the agricultural surpluses that trade connected them to, began to shrink. Archaeological evidence from the 3rd century shows a pattern of urban contraction across the Western Empire. Smaller buildings replacing larger ones, public monuments falling into disrepair. The intricate water systems that had made Roman cities so comfortable beginning to operate without maintenance. The great baths of Caracalla in Rome were still functioning. They were built in the early 3rd century and represented a genuine triumph of engineering. But across the empire, the institutional capacity to build and maintain such things was diminishing. The aqueducts of the provincial cities are particularly telling. These were complex systems that required regular inspection, repair, and the skilled labour of hydraulic engineers who understood their design. During the Pax Romana, this maintenance was funded by a combination of local taxation and imperial subvention. As the 3rd century crisis deepened, both funding streams thinned. Aqueducts fell into disrepair. Some Roman cities reverted to wells and local water sources after decades of dependence on the engineered water supply. It is a small detail in the large catastrophe of the 3rd century, but it captures the essence of what was being lost. Not just money, not just emperors, but the accumulated infrastructure of competence that money, properly managed, had built and sustained. Aurelian was assassinated in 275 AD by his own officers in circumstances that remain murky. What happened next? A rapid succession of competent but short-lived emperors, each attempting to stabilize different aspects of the crisis without the time to address all of them, suggests that the crisis of the 3rd century was not simply a run of bad luck or bad men. It was a structural problem that had been building for a century, and that required structural solutions that none of the available actors had the time, the resources, or the institutional backing to implement comprehensively. It would take an emperor of unusual vision and unusual brutality to even begin to do so. And that emperor, Diocletian, would arrive in 284 AD with a reform program so ambitious and a personality so determined that he would essentially rebuild the Roman state from the foundations up. But before we reach Diocletian, it is worth staying for a moment in the debris of the crisis, in the shrunken cities, the corroded coins, the abandoned aqueducts, the markets where prices were written on boards that had to be updated before the ink was dry, because what the crisis of the 3rd century reveals, more clearly than almost any other episode in Roman history, is the relationship between money and civilization. The Pax Romana had not merely been a period of political stability, it had been a period of economic complexity, of specialization, of trust. Trust between strangers, trust across distances, trust embodied in a coin that you could pass to someone you had never met and have them accept without question. When the coin stopped being trustworthy, that trust evaporated. And when that trust evaporated, the complex interconnected economy that had been built on it could not simply continue by other means. It simplified, it contracted, it retreated into the local and the immediate. The Roman world of the 3rd century was not a world that had lost its government. It was a world that had lost its nervous system, the medium of exchange that allowed information about value and scarcity and abundance to flow between all its parts. Money is not merely a convenience, it is the infrastructure of economic thought itself. When the coins failed, the thinking failed with them, and what was left was a world smaller and harder and less connected than the one that had existed before. If your eyes are growing heavy, let them close. The story of Rome will still be here when you return to it. If this kind of slow, careful history speaks to something in you, a subscription means the next chapter is already waiting. Rest now. We will keep going together. Diocletian was born into obscurity, which is to say that he was born into the precise circumstances from which the most driven men of the 3rd century rose. His origins are disputed. Ancient sources suggest Dalmatia, on the eastern Adriatic coast, from a family of no particular distinction. He rose through the military ranks through a combination of ability, luck, and the ruthlessness that the 3rd century required of men who intended to survive it. By 284 AD, when he had his predecessor Numerianus murdered and proclaimed himself emperor, the accusation of the murder was itself a political performance, dramatically made in front of the assembled troops. He had seen enough of the crisis to understand it with unusual clarity. What Diocletian understood, and what made him a reformer of historic significance, was that the crisis of the 3rd century was not primarily a military problem, though it had military dimensions. It was not primarily a political problem, though the instability of the imperial office had made everything else worse. It was, at its root, a fiscal and administrative problem. The Roman state had been trying for 50 years to run an empire of the 4th century on the fiscal architecture of the 1st, and the architecture had cracked under the weight. Diocletian's response was to rebuild the architecture. The Tetrarchy, the system of rule by 4, which Diocletian introduced in 293 AD, was the political expression of this administrative rethink. 2 senior emperors, the Augusti, one in the west and one in the east, would each be assisted by a junior emperor, the Caesars, who would govern their regions and eventually succeed to the senior positions. The empire was too large to be effectively governed from a single point, and the endless succession crises had demonstrated that any system that depended on a single man to function was catastrophically vulnerable. The Tetrarchy was a hedge against that vulnerability, not a perfect one, as events after Diocletian's retirement would show, but a genuine attempt to create institutional redundancy in an institution that had almost none. But the Tetrarchy was the political framework. The financial reforms were the substance. Diocletian replaced the existing, increasingly dysfunctional monetary tax system with what historians call the Eugatio Capitatio, a new assessment system that tried to calculate the productive capacity of every piece of agricultural land in the empire and levy taxes proportionally. It was a vast bureaucratic exercise. Surveyors and assessors moved through province after province, evaluating soil quality, water access, the type of crops that could be grown, the number of working adults available to farm it. The result was a more accurate picture of the empire's taxable agricultural base than Rome had possessed since Augustus's census of the early 1st century. More radically, Diocletian shifted significant portions of the tax system away from money and toward payment in kind. The annona militaris, a military supply tax that had existed in informal and emergency forms for decades, was formalized and expanded into a comprehensive system through which the army was supplied directly from the agricultural output of the provinces it was stationed in. Instead of paying taxes in coins that might be debased by the time they reached the treasury, farmers paid in grain, oil, wine, and clothing. The army received those goods directly. The connection between money and the state's most basic obligations, feeding the troops, was deliberately severed, because money could no longer be trusted to perform that function. This is a remarkable moment in financial history. Diocletian's annona reform was, in essence, an official admission by the Roman state that its own currency had failed as a medium of taxation. A monetary economy had been replaced, for its most critical function, by barter, sophisticated, bureaucratically organized barter, but barter nonetheless. The world's most sophisticated monetary system, which had monetized economic life across a territory of 50 million people, had regressed to a form of exchange that predated coinage. That is the scale of what the 3rd century had accomplished. Diocletian also attempted to reform the coinage itself. He introduced new gold and silver coins. The aureus was restruck at a higher purity, and a new silver coin, the argentius, was minted at roughly 95% silver content, the highest purity since the early empire. These were beautiful coins. They were also produced in quantities insufficient to actually replace the debased currency in circulation. The fundamental problem, that the empire needed more coins than it had silver to make them honestly, had not been solved by the reform. The new good coins circulated alongside enormous quantities of the old debased coins, and Gresham's law did its predictable work. People spent the debased coins and hoarded the new ones. It is against this backdrop, the failed monetary reform, the payment-in-kind tax system, the tetrarchic administration trying to manage an empire that had lost confidence in its own money, that we must understand the most famous economic document of the ancient world, Diocletian's Edict on Maximum Prices. Issued in 301 AD, the edict attempted to set legal maximum prices for more than 1,000 different goods and services, from a pound of pork to the daily wage of a sewer cleaner, to the cost of hiring a lion. The penalty for selling above the maximum price was, in the original proclamation, death for both the seller and the buyer. The scope of the edict is astonishing even by modern standards. It covers grain, wine, oil, and beer. It covers meat of every description: beef, mutton, pork, goat, suckling pig, venison. It covers seafood separated by quality. The best sea fish commanded a higher maximum than river fish. It covers vegetables, spices, honey, and salt. It covers textiles, from the cheapest undyed wool to the most expensive Syrian purple. It covers the wages of agricultural labourers, carpenters, bricklayers, camel drivers, riverboatmen, and schoolteachers. It covers the fees of lawyers, doctors, and notaries. It even covers the cost of writing instruction. A teacher of arithmetic could charge no more than 75 denarii per student per month, while a teacher of rhetoric and oratory was entitled to a somewhat more generous ceiling. The preamble to the edict gives us an extraordinary window into how Diocletian and his co-emperors understood the economic crisis they were trying to address. They blamed the inflation, with a directness that might seem familiar in a different historical context, on the greed of merchants and speculators, on men who were exploiting the chaos of the times to charge whatever the market would bear, who had no thought for the general welfare and every thought for their own profit. The solution, therefore, was to restrain this greed by law, to impose a ceiling on the avarice that was driving prices upward and making ordinary life unaffordable for the ordinary person. It is a compelling diagnosis. It is also almost entirely wrong. The inflation that was destroying Roman purchasing power was not caused by merchant greed. It was caused by the systematic devaluation of the currency, by decades of coins that contained steadily less silver, which meant that steadily more coins were needed to purchase the same amount of goods. A merchant who raised his prices was not being greedy. He was responding rationally to the fact that the coins he received today were worth less than the coins he had spent yesterday. Diocletian's edict tried to solve this problem by forbidding the symptom without addressing the cause, like trying to treat a fever by outlawing thermometers. The failure, when it came, was documented with unusual vividness by Lactantius, a Christian writer who was alive during Diocletian's reign, and wrote about the edict in terms that leave little doubt about its practical effect. Much blood was shed, Lactantius wrote, over small and cheap goods. He describes merchants withdrawing from markets altogether rather than sell at a loss. Goods disappeared from the stalls. The markets went quiet in a way that was more frightening than high prices had been, because at least when goods were expensive, they could still be obtained. When merchants stopped selling, nothing could be obtained at any price. The silence of a marketplace that should be noisy is a particular kind of alarm. You feel it in the pit of the stomach, that absence where exchange should be. Imagine walking through the forum of a provincial Roman city in 302 or 303 AD, a year or two after the edict's promulgation, and finding the stalls closed. The jars that should hold olive oil stand empty, the baker's bench is scrubbed clean, and there is no bread. The cloth merchant's tables are folded against the wall, not because there is no food, no oil, no cloth in the region, but because the people who sold those things have calculated correctly that selling them at the edict's maximum prices would mean selling them below the cost of production. And they are not willing to lose money on every transaction until they are bankrupt. The edict was quietly abandoned, likely not long after Diocletian's retirement in 305 AD, the first Roman emperor to voluntarily relinquish power, a decision that remains one of the stranger events in Roman political history. He retired to his palace at Split, on the Dalmatian coast, where he grew cabbages in a walled garden, and reportedly, when urged to return to imperial politics, said that those who had seen the cabbages he had grown with his own hands would not ask him to abandon them. It is the response of a man who had done what he could, understood its limits, and chosen the most dignified available exit. What Diocletian left behind was an empire that was more organized than the one he had found, somewhat more solvent, somewhat more capable of defending itself, but not fundamentally different in its economic vulnerabilities. The currency was still not trusted. The payment-in-kind system was an administrative burden of extraordinary complexity. The bureaucracy he had expanded to manage the tetrarchy, the annona, the new assessment system, was itself expensive to maintain. He had not solved the problem of Rome's fiscal sustainability. He had deferred it, organized it, made it slightly more manageable. The deferred problem would now pass to his successors, who would face it with different resources, different ideas, and different failures. There is something instructive in the fate of Diocletian's edict that resonates across the distance of 17 centuries. The attempt to regulate prices without addressing the monetary conditions that drive them is one of the most consistent errors in economic governance across all of human history. It recurs in ancient Athens during the Peloponnesian War. It recurs in medieval England during the Black Death, when the statute of labourers tried to hold wages to pre-plague levels, while the labour force that could supply them had been reduced by a third. It recurs in revolutionary France, when the law of the maximum tried to cap food prices while the assignat was collapsing. Each time the mechanics are the same. Price controls without monetary reform do not reduce prices. They reduce the supply of goods available at any price. They make scarcity official. Diocletian, standing in his Dalmatian garden, watching the late afternoon light fall across his cabbages, perhaps understood this in the way that only a retired man can understand the failures of his active years. With a quietness that is not quite regret, and not quite peace, but something in between. The empire he had tried to save was still standing. The coins he had tried to stabilize were still debased. The prices he had tried to cap were still rising. History does not always reward the determined administrator. Sometimes it simply waits for him to retire, and then continues the conversation without him. In 312 AD, on the night before the Battle of Milvian Bridge, Constantine reportedly saw a vision. Whether this vision was theological or military in nature, whether he genuinely experienced something transcendent, or whether the story was constructed afterward to legitimize his subsequent conversion to Christianity, is a question that historians and theologians have debated for 17 centuries. What is not in dispute is the outcome. Constantine defeated his rival Maxentius, entered Rome in triumph, and within the next decade consolidated control over the entire empire, in a way that no single ruler had managed since before the crisis of the 3rd century. He was a man of enormous energy and considerable strategic intelligence, and he left his mark on the Roman world in ways that were as profound in their fiscal dimensions as in their religious ones. The gold solidus, introduced by Constantine around 312 AD, was one of the most successful monetary innovations in human history. The coin weighed 4.5 grams of essentially pure gold, a standard it maintained with remarkable consistency for over 700 years, surviving the fall of Rome itself to circulate in the Byzantine Empire until the 11th century. Byzantine merchants traded it across the known world. Arab traders encountered it throughout their travels and used it as a benchmark for their own coinages. It gave rise to words in multiple languages. The English word soldier derives from it, through the Latin solidus, because soldiers' pay was increasingly denominated in this gold coin. It was, in the most literal sense, the coin of the world. The solidus was a triumph of monetary engineering. Constantine understood what earlier emperors had been slow to acknowledge, that a debased silver coin could not be rehabilitated by incremental improvements to its silver content. The accumulated mistrust was too deep, but a new gold coin, minted at a consistently high standard from a metal that the market inherently trusted, could establish a new foundation. Gold, unlike silver, had not been the primary medium of Roman debasement. The aurae had been reduced in weight during the 3rd century, but not as catastrophically as the silver denarius. By returning to gold as the monetary anchor, Constantine was choosing the metal that had been less corrupted by the centuries' abuses. For the wealthy, for the senators who owned estates across multiple provinces, for the great merchants who moved goods by the shipload, for the imperial officials who received their salaries in gold, the Solidus was a remarkable gift. Here was a coin you could trust. Here was a coin that would buy the same amount of grain in Alexandria as in Antioch, the same quantity of wine in Gaul as in Spain, without the anxiety of wondering whether the person accepting it would bite it first to test the wash. The great commercial transactions of the 4th century, the long-distance trade that the Pax Romana had built, and the 3rd century had nearly destroyed, could begin to revive, at least at the upper end of the market, on the basis of this new, reliable gold. But here is what made the Solidus, for all its brilliance, also a source of new inequality. Taxes were increasingly demanded in gold, not in debased bronze, not in payment in kind grain, in gold. A farmer in provincial Gaul or Spain who produced olives or grain and sold them in the local market received for those sales the debased bronze currency that still circulated among ordinary people in ordinary transactions. But when the tax collector arrived, he wanted gold. To convert bronze to gold, the farmer had to go to a money changer, and the money changer applied an exchange rate that reflected the vast difference in quality between the two metals. This exchange rate was, in practice, punishing. The farmer effectively had to sell far more of his produce than the nominal tax rate required, because the currency his produce earned was worth so much less than the currency the tax collector demanded. This gap between the gold economy of the elite and the bronze economy of everyone else is one of the defining features of the late Roman economy, and it is not well served by the word economy, which implies a single integrated system. The 4th century Roman world had two economies, loosely connected but operating by different rules. The gold economy was stable, trusted, and increasingly concentrated in the hands of a small number of very wealthy families and institutions. The bronze economy was inflationary, unreliable, and the daily reality for the vast majority of the population. These two economies did not simply coexist. They interacted in ways that systematically transferred wealth from the bottom to the top. The great senatorial families of the 4th century were, by almost any measure, richer than their predecessors of the 1st and 2nd centuries, richer in terms of the land they owned, the range of their estates, the diversification of their wealth across provinces. This seems paradoxical in an era of overall economic decline, but it makes perfect sense once you understand the mechanism. When the monetary economy contracts and becomes unreliable, the advantage shifts to those who own assets that do not require money to function. Land is the most obvious such asset. An estate that produces its own grain, its own wine, its own oil, its own cloth, that processes and consumes most of what it produces internally, that has its own craftsmen and its own workshops, needs very little money to sustain itself. A landowner who owns 20 such estates across 4 provinces is almost entirely insulated from the monetary instability that is destroying the livelihoods of the tenant farmers who work those estates. Constantine's conversion to Christianity, and the extraordinary patronage he subsequently bestowed on the Church, created another important economic institution that operated largely outside the monetary mainstream. He endowed basilicas in Rome, Jerusalem, and Constantinople with enormous grants of land and income-producing property. The church he was building was not simply a religious institution. It was an economic one, a major landowner, a significant employer, a repository of wealth that accumulated rather than circulated. The church's exemption from most forms of taxation, granted under Constantine and confirmed by subsequent emperors, meant that as it grew wealthier, the tax burden fell more heavily on those outside its protection. Constantinople itself, the new capital Constantine founded on the site of the Greek city of Byzantium in 330 AD, was a fiscal project as much as a political one. By shifting the imperial center of gravity eastward to a location that controlled the crucial Bosphorus Strait between Europe and Asia. Constantine was placing the imperial government closer to the more economically vital half of the empire. The eastern provinces, Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, Greece, were wealthier, more densely populated, more commercially developed than the western provinces. They generated more revenue. By making the East the seat of government, Constantine was rearranging the fiscal geography of empire in a way that would have consequences long after his own death. What Constantine could not do, what no single monetary reform, however brilliant, could do, was restore the economic vitality that the 3rd century had destroyed in the western provinces. The contraction of trade networks, the shrinkage of cities, the retreat of skilled labor, the deterioration of infrastructure, these were not conditions that a stable gold coin could reverse by itself. A good currency is a necessary condition for a functioning commercial economy. It is not a sufficient one. The fields that had gone untended, the aqueducts that had fallen into disrepair, the merchant networks that had dissolved, the urban populations that had dispersed into the countryside, none of these would simply reconstitute themselves because the coins had improved. The historian Brian Ward Perkins, in his rigorous examination of the archaeological evidence for late Roman economic decline, makes a point that deserves to be heard by anyone tempted to see the 4th century as simply a new beginning after the chaos of the 3rd. The material standard of living, measurable in pottery, in building quality, in bone evidence for diet, in the presence or absence of imported goods, declined significantly across most of the Western Empire during the 4th and 5th centuries, and did not recover for centuries afterward. The Solidus was a magnificent coin, but its magnificence circulated primarily in a world of diminishing things. There is a further dimension to the Solidus worth understanding, one that only becomes visible when you look at the coin not as money, but as a political statement. Every Solidus that circulated bore the image of the ruling emperor, struck with a precision and a consistency that the debased bronze coinage had long since abandoned. The portrait was sharp, the legends were legible. The reverse imagery, victory, the emperor in triumph, the Christian Chiro symbol from Constantine's time onward, was carefully designed and cleanly executed. This aesthetic quality was not vanity, it was policy. The coin that looked reliable was meant to carry with it the suggestion that the state behind it was reliable, that the emperor whose face it bore was in control, that the system was sound. The gold solidus was, among other things, a continuous propaganda campaign for the competence of the regime. The men who accumulated solidi in the 4th century were not only wealthy in the Roman sense, they were building the prototype of the medieval noble, the great landowner who owed military service rather than money to the crown, who fed and clothed and housed his own dependents from his own estates, who needed the state primarily as a source of legal protection and military backing, rather than as a provider of the commercial infrastructure on which earlier generations had depended. The gap between this emerging social type and the free, mobile, commercially active citizen of the Pax Romana was enormous. And yet the transition between these two worlds was so gradual, occurring over generations in small legal steps and quiet economic retreats, that no one living through it would have named it as a transformation. They would simply have noticed that their grandfather's world and their grandchildren's world were somehow, in some hard-to-specify way, different. That the things their grandfather had taken for granted were no longer quite available. That the simplifications of the new world had their own kind of logic, even if that logic was smaller and harder and less free. The two economies of the 4th century, gold and bronze, elite and ordinary, were moving in opposite directions, and the gap between them was widening in ways that the political institutions of the empire were increasingly unable to bridge. The curial class, The local magistrates and civic leaders, who had been the backbone of Roman urban life for centuries, were being crushed between the weight of their fiscal obligations above and the declining capacity of their local populations to pay taxes below. The free farmers of the Italian countryside were struggling under a tax burden that the gold economy imposed in gold, but the local market only returned in bronze. The conditions for the next chapter of the story, the chapter in which ordinary Romans began, quietly and in large numbers, to find ways to escape the system entirely, were already forming in the spaces between the gleaming gold coins and the dull bronze ones. There is a particular moment in the decline of a fiscal system when the most rational response to the system is to escape it. This moment arrives when the burden of participation, the taxes, the obligations, the personal liability, exceeds what the participant can bear, and when the penalties for non-compliance begin to seem less severe than the consequences of compliance. Rome arrived at this moment in different regions and at different times over the course of the 4th century, and what followed was one of the most consequential mass economic retreats in history: the slow, steady disappearance of the Roman taxpayer. The curiales, the local magistrates known as decurions, who formed the administrative backbone of Roman civic life, occupied one of the most unenviable positions in the late Roman world. Their role was formerly one of civic honor: to govern their city, to maintain its public buildings, to fund its games and festivals, and to collect the taxes that the imperial government required. For centuries, this had been a genuine honor, because it came with real power and real social prestige, and because the men who held these positions were typically wealthy enough that the costs of the office were manageable against their overall resources. The city councillor who paid for a new fountain or a set of public games was spending some of his surplus, not straining his capital. By the 4th century, this calculation had reversed entirely. The curiales were now personally liable for the full tax assessment of their city, meaning that if the population of their district could not pay its required tax, the decurions made up the difference from their own private wealth. This was not a new rule, exactly. The principle of curial liability had existed in various forms for centuries, but in an era of declining population, deteriorating agriculture, widespread flight from cities, and an imperial tax demand that had, if anything, increased in real terms, the gap between what the local population could pay and what the curiales were obliged to deliver was becoming, in many regions, unsurvivable. Imperial legislation of the 4th century reveals this crisis in unusual detail, because so much of what the emperors were trying to do was prevent people from leaving the curial order. Law after law attempted to prevent decurions from renouncing their civic status, from fleeing to other cities, from entering the army or the church, or any other institution that might exempt them from their municipal obligations. A decurion who became a soldier was to be returned to his city. A decurion who entered the clergy was to be replaced at his own expense by a substitute from among his relatives. Children of decurions were automatically enrolled in the curial order, regardless of their own wishes, because the supply of men willing to take on the obligations voluntarily had dried up. The Church offered one escape route. Imperial legislation after Constantine exempted clergy from curial obligations, which meant that entering holy orders was not merely a spiritual decision but a financial one. Men of curial background who could not bear the tax liability of their civic status converted their property into church donations and took minor orders, becoming, in a single legal move, both religiously credentialed and financially protected. The emperors, needing both the church's cooperation and the curial's tax collection, tried to close this loophole repeatedly, limiting the number of clergy any city could support, requiring that clergy be drawn from the poor rather than the propertied class. None of it worked very well. The incentive to escape was simply too strong. Below the curial level, in the farming communities that produced the agricultural wealth on which all Roman taxation ultimately rested, a different but equally consequential transformation was underway. The free farmers of the Italian countryside and the provincial hinterland, men who owned small plots of land, farmed them with their families, paid their taxes, and participated in the local market economy, were under pressure from several directions simultaneously. Tax demands in gold required them to sell their produce at whatever the market offered, even in poor harvest years. Competition from the great estates of senatorial families, which could undercut local prices because of their scale and their tax exemptions, was squeezing the margins on which small farmers operated. When small farmers could not pay their debts or their taxes, they faced a choice that was not really a choice. They could lose their land to creditors or to tax collectors. Or they could enter into arrangements with larger landowners, powerful senatorial families, or the church, whereby they surrendered their land in exchange for the right to continue farming it as tenants, under terms that protected them from the immediate tax burden while binding them, and eventually their descendants, to the land in perpetuity. The colony, the tenant farmers of the late empire, were not technically slaves, but they were not free in any economically meaningful sense. They could not leave the estate. They could not take employment elsewhere. The legislation that tied them to their land, beginning formally under the Emperor Diocletian and intensifying through the 4th century, was the origin of the medieval serf. The emergence of the colony system was not only a social transformation, it was a fiscal one. A free farmer who owned his land paid taxes. A colonus who farmed an estate owned by a senator or by the church existed within a tax exemption arrangement that meant his labor contributed to his landlord's wealth without generating state revenue. The more the colony system spread, the smaller the taxable population became, and the smaller the taxable population became, the heavier the burden fell on those who remained within the regular tax system, which drove more of them to seek the same kind of protection. It was a self-reinforcing dynamic of fiscal contraction, and no one in the 4th century had the conceptual tools or the political will to reverse it. There is a passage in the writings of the 5th century Bishop Salvian of Marseille that deserves to be quoted, because it describes with unusual directness what the late Roman tax system felt like from the perspective of those it crushed. Writing around 440 AD, Salvian describes poor Romans fleeing to barbarian territory, crossing the frontier to live among the Goths, or the Bagodai, the irregular rural bands who had withdrawn from Roman administration entirely. He says that these Romans preferred barbarian freedom to Roman taxation. He says that they were not traitors or cowards, but people who had simply calculated that the Roman state was taking more than it gave. They were not wrong. The Goths and the Franks and the Vandals who were settling within Roman territory, or pressing against its frontiers, were not, from the perspective of ordinary Romans in the affected regions, necessarily worse rulers than the imperial administrators they replaced. The barbarian kingdoms that emerged in the western provinces during the 5th century were often less bureaucratic, less literate in the Roman legal tradition, and certainly less classically cultivated than the Roman imperial structure. But they were also, in many cases, less fiscally demanding. A Gothic king who needed loyalty from his new Roman subjects had incentives that a Roman tax collector did not. He needed the farmers to stay, to produce, to be in some sense willing rather than merely coerced. This created, paradoxically, a somewhat more sustainable relationship between ruler and ruled. The late Roman army was, by the 4th and 5th centuries, itself a reflection of the demographic and fiscal crisis of the empire. The free Roman citizens who had formed the backbone of the republican and early imperial legions were increasingly scarce, fewer in number, harder to recruit, more likely to buy exemptions from military service than to serve willingly. In their place, the army relied heavily on barbarian federates, Germanic, Hunnic, Gothic, and Frankish soldiers who fought under Roman command, but within units that maintained their own cultural and military traditions. Men like Stilicho, the Vandal-born general who was effectively the military commander of the Western Empire during the final years of the 4th century, or Aetius, who defeated Attila at the Catalonian plains in 451 AD, were not Roman in the traditional sense. But they were what the Roman army had available. The cost of these federate armies was not always monetary. Increasingly, barbarian soldiers were paid in land grants within Roman territory rather than in coin, a payment method that reflected both the declining reliability of Roman currency and the declining supply of land outside the direct control of the great senatorial estates. Each land grant to a federate soldier was a piece of territory that no longer generated Roman tax revenue. Each piece of land removed from the tax base made the remaining territory more expensive to defend. The fiscal mathematics of late Roman military policy were, in the most generous interpretation, deeply unfavorable. There is a detail from the administrative records of this period that captures the entire situation in microcosm. The city of Antioch in Syria, one of the great cities of the ancient world, a place of sophistication and wealth that Cicero's letters and the New Testament both acknowledge as exceptional, had a curial order of some 600 members in the 2nd century AD. By the time the orator Libanius was writing in the late 4th century, the number had fallen to perhaps 60. That is a 90% reduction in the civic administrative class of one of the empire's most important cities. The reasons were the reasons we have been tracing: death, bankruptcy, flight to the church, flight to the Senate, flight to the barbarian frontier. Whatever the route, the destination was the same: out, away from the obligation, away from the liability, away from the Roman tax system. What remains when a tax system fails? What happens to the physical and social infrastructure that the tax system had built and sustained? The roads begin to deteriorate because no one is paying for their repair. The bridges are not maintained. The post system, the cursus publicus, which had allowed the Roman state to communicate across its vast territory with something approaching speed, becomes unreliable, as the horses and the relay stations and the maintenance costs of the system are no longer adequately funded. The court system becomes slower and more expensive, as the legal professionals who staffed it find their fees unpaid or their fees meaningless in debased currency. The cities shrink, the countryside simplifies. The complex specialization that a monetary economy makes possible, the ability to be a glassmaker or a stonemason or a school teacher rather than a farmer, because you can buy your food with money earned at your trade, becomes harder to sustain when the money is unreliable and the markets are thin. It is tempting, reading through these accounts of fiscal failure, to look for a single decisive error, a moment when a different decision could have changed the trajectory. But the closer you look, the more the crisis seems to have been overdetermined, the result of so many reinforcing factors that no single correction could have addressed them all. The debasement, the plague, the military costs, the flight from civic obligation, the growth of tax-exempt estates, the barbarian settlements, each of these would have been a serious challenge in isolation. Together, they constituted something that the Roman state, however determined and however capable, lacked the institutional resources to overcome. Not because Romans were less intelligent than other peoples or less hard-working or less committed to the survival of their civilization, but because the fiscal mathematics of empire, mismanaged over 2 centuries, had finally produced a set of conditions from which there was no mathematical escape. In the late summer of 410 AD, the Visigothic king Alaric led his army through the Salarian Gate and into Rome. The city had not been sacked by a foreign enemy in 800 years, not since the Gauls in 390 BC, a date so distant it had become more myth than memory. Alaric's troops spent 3 days inside the walls. They looted, selectively but thoroughly, the accumulated wealth of 8 centuries of imperial capital. Gold from the churches, silver from the palaces, portable wealth of every description that could be moved in 3 days, by an army that had been waiting outside the walls for months, and had come prepared to take what it needed. The Eternal City was not destroyed, but it was diminished, visibly and unmistakably, in a way that changed how Romans understood their own permanence. The great theologian Augustine, living in North Africa at the time, heard the news of the sack and began writing what would become the City of God, a work of philosophical theology that reframed the entire question of what Rome meant and what its fall signified, in terms that were explicitly not economic or political, but spiritual. The pagan world, Augustine argued, had made the mistake of identifying the city of man with the city of God, had confused the Roman Empire with something eternal and divinely sanctioned. The sack of Rome did not disprove God's providence. It merely demonstrated the error of those who had confused a human institution with a divine one. Augustine's response to the crisis was in its way a form of emotional stabilization, a way of making the unthinkable thinkable by reframing it as confirmation of a deeper truth. But for the people who had relied on the Roman fiscal system for their livelihoods, the merchants, the farmers, the craftsmen, the officials, the sack of 410 AD was not a theological problem. It was an economic one. The looting of Rome represented a further drain on the reserves of gold and silver that were already insufficient to sustain the military and administrative costs of the Western Empire. The revenue loss was compounded by the psychological shock. If Rome could be sacked, if the walls of the Eternal City were not invulnerable, then the whole edifice of Roman permanence that underpinned economic confidence was revealed as contingent. Investment requires confidence in the future. Confidence in the future requires some belief that the institutions governing that future will persist. After 410 AD, that belief was harder to sustain. The loss of North Africa, beginning with the Vandal crossing into the province in 429 AD and completed with the fall of Carthage in 439 AD, was, in fiscal terms, even more devastating than the sack of Rome. The North African provinces, Tunisia, Algeria, and parts of Libya in modern geography were among the most agriculturally productive territories in the Roman world. They supplied enormous quantities of grain, oil, and wine to Rome and to the Western armies. They generated substantial tax revenue. They were, in the language of modern corporate accounting, core assets. When the Vandals under Gaiseric seized them, the Western Empire lost not only the provinces, but the tax revenue they had generated, the grain they had provided, and the strategic depth they had offered against further Vandal expansion. The arithmetic of this loss was, for the Western Empire, essentially fatal. Without North Africa, the revenue available to fund the Western Army fell below the minimum required to maintain it at effective strength. Without an effective army, the remaining provinces could not be defended. Without defensible provinces, tax revenue fell further. The feedback loop that the crisis of the 3rd century had hinted at, where falling revenue led to military weakness, which led to territorial loss, which led to falling revenue, now completed itself in the West, with a finality that left no room for the kind of partial recoveries that the 3rd century had permitted. The story of Roman Britain provides perhaps the most archaeologically vivid illustration of what the end of a monetary economy actually looks like on the ground. For 3.5 centuries, Britain had been part of the Roman imperial system, garrisoned, administered, taxed, and monetized. Roman coins circulated from the military garrison towns of the north to the trading settlements of the south coast, paying for goods and services that a pre-Roman British economy could not have produced or imagined. The villas of the Romano-British elite were substantial, comfortable structures with mosaic floors and underfloor heating. The towns had public baths, law courts, and marketplaces. Around 410 AD, the same year as Alaric's sack of Rome, in what feels like more than coincidence, but is perhaps simply the compression of a general crisis into a few notorious dates, the Roman imperial government effectively acknowledged that it could no longer maintain its position in Britain. The legions were withdrawn, or rather what remained of them was redistributed elsewhere, and the administrative and fiscal apparatus of Roman Britain was left to manage itself. What happened next has been traced by archaeologists in extraordinary detail. Coin use in Britain falls off a cliff around this date, not gradually, over decades, steeply within a generation. There is a specific archaeological fact that brings this home with unusual force. Roman Britain had been supplied with coins through a regular system of mint deliveries from the continent. New coins arrived periodically to supplement those in circulation and to replace worn ones. After 410 AD, no new coins arrived. The coins already in circulation continued to be used for a while, but they were not replaced as they wore out or were lost. Within a generation or two, there were simply not enough coins in circulation to sustain a monetary economy. People reverted to barter and to gift exchange, and to the older patterns of obligation and reciprocity that had organized British economic life before the Romans arrived. The last Roman coin in a British transaction was not a dramatic event. It was an absence. One more transaction completed, one more coin passed from hand to hand, and then no more coin. The market went on, but the money had gone. What does the end of a monetary economy feel like to the people living through it? The literary sources for late Roman Britain are thin to the point of invisibility, but archaeology offers some answers. The pottery changes. The mass-produced, standardized Roman ceramics that had been available to even modest households disappear and are replaced by locally made vessels of much lower quality, because the trade networks and the specialized workshops that produce the good pottery no longer exist. The diet changes. The bone evidence suggests a narrowing of the food available, a retreat from the diversity that trade had made possible toward whatever could be produced locally. The buildings change. Timber replaces stone because the specialized skills and the organizational capacity required to quarry, transport, and lay stone require institutions that the post-Roman period could not sustain. In the city of Roman London, Londinium, which had been a substantial commercial city of perhaps 30,000 inhabitants, occupation patterns show a radical discontinuity in the early 5th century. The floors of buildings that had been continuously inhabited for generations are suddenly covered not by the debris of daily life, but by a layer of dark earth, a mixture of decayed organic material and wind-blown soil that indicates abandonment. Streets that had been maintained for centuries are no longer repaired, and the layer of debris that accumulates in the wheel ruts tells archaeologists that carts stopped using them. The forums and basilicas that were the commercial and legal heart of the city stand empty, not destroyed, empty. It is the emptiness that is most unsettling, the silence of a space built for crowds. Back on the continent, the formal end of the Western Empire arrived in 476 AD when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople with a letter explaining that the Western territory did not need a separate emperor, because the Eastern emperor's authority was sufficient. The event that later historians would call the Fall of Rome was, in the contemporary telling, almost administrative. There was no great battle, no burning of cities, no mass death. There was a letter. There was a young man sent to live out his days in a comfortable villa near Naples. There was a title, Western Emperor, that ceased to be filled. Odoacer and his Ostrogothic successors, particularly Theodoric the Great, who took control of Italy in 493 AD, made genuine efforts to maintain Roman administrative traditions. Cassiodorus, the Roman bureaucrat who served as Theodoric's chief minister, wrote letters in elaborate classical Latin that tried to preserve the forms of Roman governance, even as their substance was being remade by new demographic realities. Theodoric maintained the Roman Senate. He preserved the tax system, or a version of it. He kept the mint functioning, though the coins it produced were different in composition and design from the classical denarius. He was, in his way, trying to preserve what could be preserved of the fiscal architecture of an empire that was no longer there. It could not be preserved. The revenue base was too small, the population too mobile, the trade networks too disrupted, the institutional memory of complex administration too eroded by a century of crisis. What emerged in the western provinces over the following 2 centuries was not a simplified Rome. It was something genuinely different, a collection of regional kingdoms, each operating on much smaller economic scales, each relying primarily on agricultural production and local exchange, each retaining fragments of Roman law and Latin language, while the economic complexity those things had been built to manage was slowly forgotten. The historian Brian Ward Perkins has calculated that it took Western Europe until somewhere in the 18th century to recover the economic complexity of the Roman world at its height, to reach again the levels of long-distance trade, urban population, architectural sophistication, and commercial integration that the Pax Romana had sustained. That is not a recession. That is not a downturn. That is a contraction of civilizational depth that lasted roughly 1,300 years. The coins that stopped being minted, the aqueducts that stopped being maintained, the roads that slowly became rutted paths, and then forest tracks, these were not merely inconveniences. They were the material substrate of a way of living together that, once lost, required more than a millennium to rebuild. The last Roman coin is not a specific object. It is an idea, the idea of money, of trust embodied in metal, of a promise made durable enough to pass between strangers. That idea did not die in 476 AD. It survived in Byzantium, in the gold Solidus that Constantine had introduced, and that Byzantine mints would continue to produce for centuries. It survived in the Church, which continued to operate financial institutions even as the secular economy contracted. It survived in the memory of Roman law, which preserved the legal framework for contract and property and exchange even in centuries when those concepts were exercised on very modest scales. But in the West, in the fields of Britain and Gaul and Spain and Italy, where Roman coins had once moved freely through markets and workshops and soldiers' pay chests, the idea went quiet for a very long time. Not silent, not entirely absent, but quiet, the way a language goes quiet when its last fluent speakers die. Not erased, but no longer spoken naturally, no longer the medium through which people lived their daily lives without thinking about it. The monetary economy of Rome had been, at its height, exactly that, something so deeply embedded in daily life that no one had to think about it. It was the air of the ancient economy, invisible and essential. And like air, you only noticed it fully when it was gone. The story told in this documentary rests on a foundation of primary and secondary sources that have been the subject of sustained historical debate for centuries, and it seems worth acknowledging some of that debate honestly before we close. Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, published between 1776 and 1789, is still the work from which all subsequent accounts of Rome's collapse take their bearings, if only because they must decide whether to follow him or argue with him. Gibbon's thesis was essentially cultural and religious. He believed Christianity had sapped the martial and civic virtues that Rome required, and that the barbarians had filled a vacuum created by Roman moral decline. Modern historians have found this argument incomplete at best. The economic and fiscal dimensions of Rome's decline, which Gibbon acknowledged but did not foreground, have become, in subsequent scholarship, the primary explanatory framework. Peter Heather's The Fall of Rome, published in 2006, makes the case that external pressure from barbarian peoples was the primary driver of the Western collapse, and that the empire was more economically and militarily resilient than older accounts suggest. Brian Ward Perkins's The Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization, published in the same year, argues with equal force for the catastrophic nature of the economic contraction that accompanied the political collapse. These two books represent the most serious recent engagement with the question, and they are not entirely at odds. External pressure and internal fiscal weakness reinforced each other in ways that neither alone can fully explain. The coin-silver content figures cited throughout this documentary are drawn from metallurgical analyses of surviving Roman coins. using techniques that allow historians to measure the actual composition of ancient alloys with remarkable precision. These analyses confirm what the ancient literary sources suggest, that debasement proceeded in stages, with identifiable accelerations corresponding to known fiscal crises. The Egyptian papyrus price data, which shows the inflation of the 3rd century in stark numerical terms, has been compiled and analysed by scholars including Ramsay MacMullen and Roger Bagnall, whose work on the late antique economy remains essential reading. The question of whether Rome's economic decline was inevitable, whether the fiscal model of an empire built on conquest was always going to collapse once expansion ended, remains genuinely open. Some historians see the crisis of the 3rd century as a contingent catastrophe that a luckier sequence of emperors might have navigated. Others see it as the working out of structural contradictions that were present from the beginning. This documentary has leaned toward the structural view because the evidence of coin debasement and fiscal stress predates the political chaos that accelerated it. But the debate is one of the most interesting in ancient history, and it has not been settled. There is a silver denarius in the British Museum, minted in approximately 60 BC during the last generation of the Roman Republic. It weighs roughly 3.9 grams. Its silver content is approximately 97%. On one side is the head of a deity, the diework sharp and precise, the portrait carrying the conviction of a civilization that believed in what it was making. On the other side are 2 figures on horseback, galloping into a space that the coin's edge contains but cannot quite hold. The coin has been handled by hands that are long dust. It has been spent and received, and spent again more times than any inventory could track. It has passed through wars and plagues and the rise and fall of the entire structure that gave it meaning. And it is still here. What a coin remembers is not the transactions it witnessed. It remembers composition. It remembers what it was made of, in the year it was made, by hands that were following instructions from a state that still believed in the promise the coin represented. The metallurgical analysis that tells us a 1st century denarius was 97% silver, and a 3rd century Antoninianus was 3% silver, is not just a measurement. It is a record of changing trust, of the slow, reluctant, incrementally rationalized decision to make the coin say one thing while containing another. The lesson that Rome's monetary history offers is not a simple one, and it would be dishonest to reduce it to a slogan. It is not merely that debasement is bad, or that fiscal discipline is good, or that empires should not overextend themselves. These things are true, but they are too simple to be useful. The more interesting lesson is about the relationship between money and time. Trust, once extended, takes time to erode. A debased coin does not immediately cause prices to rise. A failing fiscal system does not immediately cause an empire to fall. There is always a lag, a period during which the system runs on the inertia of past trustworthiness, on the accumulated credibility of institutions that were once genuinely reliable. That lag is dangerous precisely because it makes the problem invisible, until it has grown too large to address incrementally. The Romans who lived through the 2nd century, the long, comfortable decades of the Antonine peace, had no way of knowing that the modest debasements of their era were the beginning of a trajectory that would, within a century, produce coins that were essentially bronze. Each individual reduction seemed manageable. Each was defended by pointing to the reductions that had already occurred without catastrophe. The catastrophe, when it finally arrived in the 3rd century, surprised almost everyone, because each step toward it had seemed small. You are lying somewhere quiet as the night deepens around you. The world you inhabit is built on systems of trust so pervasive and so invisible that they require a very specific kind of attention, the kind that this slow, late-night journey through Rome has perhaps begun to cultivate. The money in your pocket, or in the number on a screen that represents your account, is a promise made by institutions whose stability you largely take for granted. That is not a reason for anxiety. It is simply a fact worth knowing, the way it is worth knowing that the ground beneath a city was once a marsh, or that the silver in an ancient coin was mined by hands that are now part of the earth they worked. The systems we live inside have histories, and their histories are, in the end, the history of us. If your eyes are growing heavy, let them close. The story of Rome will still be here when you return to it. If this kind of slow, careful history speaks to something in you, a subscription means the next chapter is already waiting. Rest now. We will keep going together. Let the story settle now. Let it find its place among the things you carry without effort, the things you know without quite knowing when you learned them. The room around you is quiet. Whatever sounds exist, a fan, a breath of air, the distant movement of a city that never fully sleeps, are part of the same long continuity that includes the markets of the Roman Forum, and the mint along the Via Sacra, and the scales that weighed the silver that became the coins that built the world. We are still, slowly and incompletely, inheriting. The denarius is gone. The empire that minted it is gone. The men and women who spent it in the market stalls of Carthage and London, and Alexandria and Rome are gone, with their hopes and their calculations and their quiet daily faith that the coin they held was what it said it was. But what they built with those coins, the roads, the legal traditions, the languages, the very shapes of European cities whose streets still follow the Roman grid, outlasted the money that made them possible. Things made with care tend to last longer than the systems that produced them. That is not always true, but it is true often enough to be worth remembering. Close your eyes if they are not already closed. The night is doing what the night does, holding you, keeping its own slow time, indifferent to the urgency that the day manufactures and that the night dissolves. You do not need to understand everything about Rome. You do not need to remember every emperor, every debasement, every fiscal crisis catalogued across these hours. It is enough to have travelled through it, to have felt the weight of the centuries, to have heard the quieter story beneath the drama of swords, deeds, and politics. The story of silver and trust, and what happens when the two diverge. Sleep comes the way most important things come, not all at once, but gradually, settling over the edges of consciousness, like the tide coming in across a flat shore. The mind releases its grip on the sequence of things. The order of events, Nero, then the plague, then the crisis, then Diocletian, then the last coin, softens into something less linear, more like the quality of an era than its chronology. The past becomes what it always becomes at this hour, a texture, a presence, a weight that is not unpleasant to carry into sleep. If you liked this journey through the deep history of Rome's economy, leave a comment below and let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. I'm always genuinely curious about that. And if you have a topic you'd like to fall asleep to next, another empire, another currency, another slow unraveling of the systems that humans build to make sense of value and exchange, leave it in the comments as well. The archive is deep. The nights are long. There is always another story waiting in the dark. Sleep well.